What if everything you were taught about the origins of creation stories was incomplete? What if the spiritual foundations of Western religion didn't begin in the deserts of ancient Israel, but centuries earlier, in the heart of Africa? What if the very concept of speaking the world into existence, the divine word that creates reality, was an African idea first? This is not speculation. This is documented history that somehow never made it into your textbooks. Long before Genesis was ever written down, before the Torah scrolls were inked, Africa was recording humanity's oldest conversations with the divine. The pyramid texts of ancient Kemet, carved into stone chambers deep within the pyramids of Saqqara around 2400 BCE, stand as the earliest religious writings ever discovered. These weren't simple burial instructions. They were profound theological statements about the nature of existence, death, and rebirth. While most of the ancient world still relied purely on oral tradition, African scribes were preserving complex spiritual philosophy in stone. But the pyramid texts were just the beginning. In the great city of Memphis, priests developed what scholars now call the Memphite Theology. At its center was Ptah, the creator god who spoke the universe into existence, the divine word. Sound familiar? The concept that would later appear in Genesis, that God spoke and creation obeyed, was already ancient African theology 1,000 years before Hebrew was even a written language. Travel north along the Nile to Hermopolis. There, another creation story flourished, the Ogdoad. 8 primordial deities representing the chaos before existence, darkness and light, infinity and nothingness. From their interaction, the first mound of earth emerged from the cosmic waters. From that mound came Ra, the sun, bringing order to chaos. This wasn't mythology for its own sake. This was ancient Africa grappling with the deepest questions of existence. These ideas didn't stay confined to Kemet. They flowed south into Nubia, into the powerful Kingdom of Kush. Kushite priests adapted and preserved these traditions, adding their own profound insights. When Kushite pharaohs ruled Egypt during the 25th dynasty, they didn't just conquer territory, they became guardians of Africa's most ancient spiritual wisdom. The connections run deeper still. Ethiopia's Kebra Nagast, though compiled around the 6th century CE, preserves oral traditions that stretch back into the mists of antiquity. It tells of Solomon and Sheba, yes, but also of wisdom traditions that predated both figures. Ethiopian scholars maintain that their spiritual knowledge came from a lineage older than anything in the Mediterranean world. They weren't wrong. Here's what your history classes never mentioned. When early Hebrew scribes began compiling what would become Genesis, they were living in a world saturated with Egyptian and African ideas. The Hebrew Bible, as we know it, wasn't written down in its current form until around the 6th century CE at the earliest. That's nearly 2,000 years after the pyramid texts. The cultural exchange wasn't accidental. The Israelites spent generations in Egypt. They absorbed, they adapted. They carried African theological concepts into their own developing tradition. This is not about diminishing anyone's faith. This is about recognizing the African roots of ideas that shaped human civilization. But something happened to this knowledge. As colonial powers carved up Africa, they brought with them a narrative of superiority. Africa became the dark continent in their telling, a place without history, without sophistication, without ancient wisdom. The thousands of manuscripts preserved in Timbuktu's libraries, the sophisticated theological systems of the Nile Valley, the complex oral traditions maintained across generations, all of it was dismissed or deliberately suppressed. It was easier to justify colonization if Africans could be portrayed as people without a meaningful past. The evidence was always there. The pyramid texts didn't disappear. The temples still stood, but the story told about them changed. Ancient Egypt was often separated from Africa in the Western imagination, repositioned as somehow Mediterranean or Middle Eastern. Anything to avoid acknowledging that the world's oldest civilization, the birthplace of so much human knowledge, was undeniably African. Scholars today are working to correct this erasure. They're examining the timeline with clear eyes. They're tracing the movement of ideas across cultures. They're recognizing that the flow of knowledge in the ancient world moved in all directions and that Africa was often the source, not the recipient. The Memphite priests who wrote of Ptah speaking creation into existence couldn't have known their ideas would echo through millennia. They couldn't have imagined their theology would influence religions practiced by billions. They were simply recording what they understood to be truth. What else don't we know? What other truths are buried in the African soil, preserved in texts we haven't yet read, carried in oral traditions we haven't yet recorded? How much of human history's foundation rests on African innovation that we've forgotten or ignored? The answers are waiting in archives, in archaeological sites, in the memories of elders whose traditions stretch back beyond written memory. Africa's ancient wisdom didn't disappear. We just stopped looking for it. If this hidden history fascinates you, you're in the right place. Here at History Off the Map, we dig into the forgotten stories that shaped our world, the histories that got left out, the truths that challenge what we thought we knew. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of What They Didn't Teach You. Drop a comment with what surprised you most, and hit that like button if you believe these stories deserve to be told. There's so much more to uncover together.